Good afternoon, everybody. So it's my pleasure to introduce Mary Selkever. So, thank you. It's my pleasure to introduce Mary Selkever. Mary and David moved to Newbridge in December of 2021. So they're relatively new residents, and we welcome them here. And Mary is going to give us a talk today about personal reflections on caregiving. Mary has a background in elementary school education and child development. After completing graduate school in Boston, she taught in Boston Public Schools and Cambridge Head Start. In 1972, when David took up a position at Hopkins, they moved to Baltimore, and she was director of parent and teacher education at a child advocacy organization. Mary was also the founding director of Learning Independence Through Computers, a non-profit technology center for children and adults with disabilities. And I believe that she was way ahead of her time in that computers were not as universally available as they are today. Anyway, we look forward to your talk, Mary, and thank you.
Thank you. I'd like to start out with a moment of silence for Ukraine. We can think about all the folks over there, wishing them all the best and hoping that the fighting ends soon. I'm pleased to welcome all of you today and see such a nice crowd out there. At first it was all women, and I thought, oh, women are the caregivers, but not necessarily. Now we have quite a few men in the audience, so that's great. First, I'd like to introduce two of my family members who are here. My husband, Dave, who lives here, and my daughter, Katya, who's in the back row at the left, who I invited 2 hours ago, and she managed to get down here. Katya is now our caregiver, so the tables have turned. I'm going to break up my talk into various areas. I want to talk about caregiving primarily, and also the office that Dave and I started later when our children were older. And in terms of caregiving, I wanted to talk about the challenges, the rewards, what we learned, the amazing friends we made, the experts we met, and how this expanded our lives. First, I'm just going to talk for a minute about my background, and then talk mostly about our daughter, Tammy, and then my new career in technology. And finally, I'd love to hear from you. I'm sure almost everyone in this room has been a caregiver at one time or another and has a lot to contribute. This is Dave and me in 1967. We look quite a bit slimmer and younger, and we lived in Boston. We were in graduate school, and life seemed easy. We were students. We enjoyed classical music together, bluegrass music, political campaigning, and playing tennis. During the Vietnam War, Dave was going to be drafted, and off we went to Washington, D.C. for 2 years, where he served in the Public Health Service. And then we moved to Baltimore, where we lived for 47 years. Our first and oldest child was born in Boston, 1969. Um, and 49 years after being in Baltimore, we moved back to Boston, to our roots, and to two of our children, twin girls, Katya and Tamara, known as Katie and Tammy, who both live in Boston. Oops, haven't quite gotten there yet, sorry. Tell you just a brief bit about my background. I was always interested in teaching and working with children and adults, and in college I did tutoring with children who were hearing impaired, and also spent a lot of time in the South doing tutoring in Mississippi and in Florida, in the orange groves. I took a year off from college and taught on the Lower East Side of New York in Hamilton-Madison Settlement House, and I taught English to Puerto Rican children. My education is in elementary education and child development, and my first jobs were in Roxbury at the William Lloyd Garrison School, and I understand that David back here went there as a student. You did too, Judy? Oh my, so 2 students from William Lloyd Garrison, 3, any more? Great, well then you know where it is, okay. And then I taught in Cambridge Head Start, and also at the Brandeis Lab School, Nursery School. Then we moved to Washington where I didn't work, and then to Baltimore. We'll start on Tammy's life, which also involves Katie and an older brother. We were expecting 1 child, we thought, and actually they couldn't hear any heartbeat near the end. I had put on a lot of fluid, and they thought the doctor thought it was probably a stillborn, but he didn't know for sure. Off we raced to the hospital in an ice storm, as I recall, leaving Alex with a neighbor. And we got there, and about 20 minutes later, they said push, and out came Tammy first. She was a smaller twin, 2 pounds 4 ounces. And then came Katie, 2 pounds 14 ounces. So they sort of looked like chickens when they were born. They were moved to Children's Hospital in Washington immediately, and stayed there for 3 months until they were 5 pounds. When they were very little, when they were first born, Katie needed a colostomy because fluid wasn't passing through her and there was an intestinal obstruction, which is why I went into labor early. At about 6 months, we found out that Tammy had what's called retinopathy of prematurity. This is an eye disease. It's caused by oxygen given at birth. She couldn't breathe, and it pulls the membranes pull the retina off. First the membranes expand, then they contract and pull the retina off. So she had lost her sight in her right eye, and she had usable sight in her left eye, not very good, but enough to see light and dark and actually to read a bit in elementary school. This is when they're 10 weeks. You can see how little they look. And they were almost ready to come home at that point. When Tammy was about 6 months, we noticed more and more she was very cranky and she was very stiff. Her legs sort of crossed and were straight, and she was diagnosed with cerebral palsy. So while we were this was all while we were in Washington, and we also had a wild Indian as an older brother who, he had been wild before they arrived, but he was really wild after they got there. It was just too much for him, all the attention and the worry and everybody being nervous about the twins, and he was not quite 2 years old when they were born. So we had Alex also on our mind. some of the people and experts that we turned to were, first of all, Selma Freiberg, who was a psychoanalyst at University of Michigan, and she had written articles and books about the sighted and the blind, infants, called Insight into the Sighted and the Blind, and we contacted her. We also brought Tammy up to Johns Hopkins, where Arnold Patz was a famous retina surgeon who had studied Tammy's eye disease and was probably the leading expert in the country at that point, and he took a look at her. We also found out that Columbia Lighthouse for the Blind in Washington was a wonderful place for support. And I also joined a Mothers of Twins Club, which was great because we could all sort of complain and laugh and tell stories and whatever. And one of our saving graces was a family up the street from us. When we moved to Washington, we lived on the third floor of a walk-up apartment by choice, because Dave didn't want anybody above him while he was working, so we wouldn't have any noise. And we had one car, so we lived right next door to where he worked in Rockville. And then we brought these twins home, and the washing machine and dryer were in the basement of the building. And it only took a couple days for me to decide, this is not for me, taking 3 kids down the stairs to do the laundry. It just wasn't going to work. So we moved and rented a little house in Bethesda near Old Georgetown Road, and we were so fortunate because up the street from us was a big Catholic family, 5 boys, 5 girls. And they were our saviors. Every day the girls would call and ask whose turn it was, because they came down and fed all 3 kids. We lined them up in a row with a big oilcloth underneath, and they also bathed them all. And that really helped us get through the day. And we're still in touch with the main babysitter there, who now lives in Texas. And I mention them because I think throughout our lives there have been key people who have made such a difference in how we survived. We moved to Baltimore when the girls were about 1.5, and you can see how small Tammy is. She's on the right compared to Katie. Tammy weighed 8 pounds at a year. This is more like 1 3/4 years. You're seeing her now, and the big brother on the left. And when we got to Baltimore, we wanted to find activities for the kids, and luckily there were neighbors with children the same age who offered to include Tammy in a play group. So Tammy and Katie were in a toddler group with 2 other little girls, and that lasted until they went off to nursery school and daycare. Again, people were so welcoming to us and to Tammy, and took her everywhere the playgroup went. So if they went on a trip to a park, Tammy went and rode in a little wagon and was included in everything. When the girls were 3, they started at nursery school and daycare, and we found a wonderful program that was very international, very accepting. They took Tammy right in with no supports. This was before there was a lot of support for programs like that. And she went up and down the stairs slowly. She played on the playground. She did everything with the other kids, total inclusion. Before inclusion was an in thing to do. So we were very fortunate. Here's a picture of Tammy learning to walk. She had heavy braces on her legs and tripods. And over time, she learned to walk. She got better. She walked with a cane. She had surgery. She still walked with a cane. And then as she got older, more in her 20s and 30s, she started to deteriorate in terms of her ability to walk and stand. So now she's in a wheelchair outdoors and she's called an indoor ambulator. She walks in her apartment, but not very far. Next in our lives was elementary school, and this was challenging. The public law that said that children with disabilities had a right to a free, appropriate education in the least restrictive environment was passed in 1975. And that's when Tammy entered school. I think it was 1976. She went to our elementary school in Baltimore City, our public school, and nobody knew what to do because the law was so new. The first, what's called an individual education program, which is your document for what the child should receive in the school, what services, was Xerox from a book. And so I thought, I really need to learn more about Public Law 94-142 and what our rights were and what we could get for Tammy. So I applied to take courses at University of Maryland Law School in special ed and learned all about the law. At that point, she had some usable vision in her left eye. She could read slowly, but it had to be very large print with dark magic markers. I'm going to go ahead one. So this is elementary school age. And you can see Tammy, Katie's always supporting Tammy, holding her up. I have so many pictures of her. This is Katie on the right, Tammy on the left. We had a low vision teacher who came once a week, which wasn't so useful because it wasn't often enough. And so Dave and I would go down each morning on our way to work and copy everything off the blackboard because she couldn't see the blackboard. She didn't see that well. And we'd write it in print in magic marker. We got books on tape. We recorded things. Alex and Katie recorded things. And we managed to put together a program for her. There was no resource room at the school at the beginning, so she did not go out to a resource room, which is often typical of what a special ed child might do. I wanted to add that in her class was, which is relevant to last night's Oscars, or was it Sunday night? Yeah, last night, Jada Pinkett Smith. And Jada Pinkett came to a couple birthday parties at our house, and she was lovely. So we know somebody famous. I started back to work when the girls started elementary school, and I worked part-time for a child advocacy organization that was very flexible in terms of my work hours. Some of the other challenges that we had were transportation. There was a school bus. We lived about 3/4 of a mile from the school, but it didn't have a lift, the bus that came to our school, so she couldn't get on the bus. So this was a problem. A neighbor picked her up, and then Alex walked home quickly and met her at the other end until I got home. The playground was a problem because there were no curb cuts. So she couldn't get from the school across the street to the playground. It was just a cement playground with a few little things on it. And so we pushed and pushed to get a curb cut. And in this case, we went to a friend who was right under the mayor to get it done because it didn't seem to get done otherwise. And when they came and did it, and I came to look at it, I couldn't believe it. They put a curb cut on one side and not the other. So I don't know what they were thinking about, but so then we had to start all over again to get the other curb cut. But we did succeed, and she walked well enough to walk across the street and get to the playground. We also noticed as computers started to be used, not in the school, but in people's homes, that she could learn to use a computer if she could learn to touch type. So we requested typing as an activity for her to learn to touch type. And by the end of elementary school, going into middle school, she was using a computer, and it printed out only in dot matrix, which is the way they used to do with these little X things. So, and it was longer horizontal than vertical, the print. And there was nothing you could do about it. So we would print it out and then draw a marker through the dot matrix so she could see it. And soon that improved after a couple years. There were fonts and choices, and you could make it bigger and all that sort of thing. So that was her elementary school years. I wanted to read just a little bit. There are some of these articles sitting on that table if anybody wants to look. Most of those things I want back, but this article I have extras to show you how her brain worked, and also the things that we take for granted that were a challenge for her. She said she had written this on her typewriter. And this is a child who is not very verbal. She doesn't give you much. When you ask, you get a sentence, maybe. Unless it has to do with the dog, and then she will go on and on. So she has a lot of trouble verbalizing things, but a lot of ideas in her head. So she wrote, this is when she was in kindergarten. I have an arrangement where I put the chair, this is at the end of the day, when the kids would turn their chairs upside down and put them on the desk, okay? Which we all take for granted. I have an arrangement where I put the chair up on the desk when I am finished working. There are 5 steps you must follow. So she had figured this all out in her brain. The first step is to turn the chair around so that the back of the chair is against the desk. Then you roll it over so that the legs are in the air and the neck is on the floor. Next, you must get in position to grab the 2 back legs. Now you must lift the chair up and finally place the seat of the chair on top of the desk. So she had written all that for something, I don't remember what, and figured it all out, but very challenging for her. Find my clicker. I wanted to divert before I go into middle school and upper school and talk about some of the things she really enjoyed and how we access activities in those areas. She always loved music, and this is when she was probably 2.5 or 3. We had an auto harp I used to use when I taught school, and she was interested in strumming it. And she sang and really enjoyed music, so we tried to do a lot of music with her. This is when she was learning to play the flutophone, which is sort of like a simplified recorder. Dave was usually in charge of music lessons in our family, so there he was instructing her. And then when she got older, and this is middle school age, she learned to play the piano a little bit. And this is at a recital, so she's posing. She also loved baseball, and of course her brother and her sister played baseball, both of them, and other sports. And Tammy had learned to swim, but other than that, she had not learned to play baseball. And we found a group that, through Parks and Recreation, that sponsored beep ball for the blind. So the ball beeps and the bases beep. So you hit the ball, the outfielders can hear it coming, and this was for visually impaired and blind. And then you listen to where the beep is coming from the first base, and you also have a coach with you running next to you if you go off track a bit, and that's how you play. And she did that for a number of years and really enjoyed it. So she had her baseball activity. Parallel to that, a friend of ours loved baseball as she did. She loved the Orioles, especially when they were still winning, which is many years ago. And he was a newspaper reporter and knew people in the press box. So they would get cheap tickets and then they'd talk their way into the press box and sit behind, I don't, if there are any baseball fans here, behind John Miller, who was a wonderful announcer in Baltimore at the time, and go to all the games. And this was before they had all this computerized stuff for the announcers, so it was much more interesting. And they would sit, and especially Tammy, who could not see the field, and listen to the ball game. We could also get tickets right behind home plate in those days for people with disabilities and sit right behind the screen, and she'd get some sense of what was going on the field. So we did a lot of going to baseball games and seeing the Orioles. She also learned to swim in our neighborhood pool, and when she did go on to Maryland School for the Blind, she was on the swim team. She also loved animals. We always had dogs, and you later will see her own dog that lives up here. She also went to a camp on Martha's Vineyard called Camp Jabberwocky for kids with cerebral palsy, and that led us to find Chilmark Chocolates. Has anybody been to Chilmark Chocolates? One person? Okay. Two. Chilmark Chocolates is in Chilmark on the Vineyard, and they hire children and young adults with disabilities and older adults. And we contacted them, and Tammy got a job there in the summers while the other kids were in camp or vacationing, whatever. And she made almond butter crunch for several years. The inside was like a Heath bar, and then she rolled it in chocolate and then rolled it in nuts. She also ran the cash register. There were only three prices, $2.50, $5, and $10 when they first started. So it wasn't too hard to do. She shortchanged Walter Cronkite, and so I am told, I was not there, and she waited on Beverly Sills. So she was lucky. I don't think she realized how lucky she was. So that was a wonderful thing that she did for work. And finally, she became a member of Yahan, which is part of National Conference of Synagogue Youth out of New York, with chapters all over the country. And every summer, before she had a full-time job, she would travel with them. This is Tammy in Israel. She went 3 times to Israel, and somehow they got her up to the top of Masada. I have no idea how they did it, but I don't know if they took her wheelchair or what, but up she went. And she went to Canada, Florida, California, all over with them, and they would go for 5-week trips in the summer. It was just fabulous. Most of the kids who went, teenagers and young adults, had disabilities such as autism, cognitive impairments. Tammy was one of the few who had physical impairments or blindness. The helpers were all people in the helping profession, so graduate students in social work, medical school, speech language, and they were just fabulous. And welcomed Tammy and took her everywhere. She also belonged to the chapter in Baltimore, so that was her main social life for many years because they had lots of activities. So that's sort of how we filled things in, because otherwise she would have been sitting home by herself with us. Going back to, let me see how my time's going, 2:30, okay. Wanted to mention she had many, many specialists and doctors. I think I counted up 14. She had 4 ophthalmologists in Baltimore. Cornea, retina, there's someone who did tarsorrhaphes, and then a regular eye doctor. Lots of other specialists too. Oh, it says quit. I don't want to quit. Wait a minute. Oh, it quit. I'm sorry. Wait a minute. Let me go back. Ah, okay. Here I am. Let's see. Hold on. Am I back to where I was? See if this is the right picture. No, I'm a little ahead of myself. Yeah, okay. I'm going to talk about her middle and high school years. After she finished elementary school, it was pretty clear she could not go on to the Baltimore City middle schools. She would have gone to a rough middle school that was huge, didn't have good services, and it was too large for her to walk around. So we needed to find an alternative. We looked at private schools, and she actually was accepted at one, but we felt that there was so much outdoor activity. It was a school that emphasized nature and being outdoors and gardening, things Tammy really couldn't do, that it didn't make a lot of sense. So our alternative was Maryland School for the Blind, which I was not happy about because she had been included in school all this time. But it seemed like the best of the alternatives. And it was not a particularly good experience overall. If I had to do it over again, I'm not sure where we would turn to. The school had fairly low expectations of the kids, and Tammy did not like school. She didn't want to go, and she didn't make friends, so it was not an easy time. We didn't really see eye to eye with the school. We worked to get her occupational therapy because we wanted her to learn to be able to tie her shoes and button and zipper, and they wanted her to put pegs in holes. And I said I didn't think she needed to learn to put pegs in holes. So we hired an outside OT, and she learned to tie her shoes. 18 steps going backwards to learn to tie them. We wanted to tape some classes. She was a very slow learner and couldn't take notes quickly, and they didn't have any devices in the classroom for typing and taking notes, and we were told you weren't allowed to tape. And I said, really? In a school for the blind, you're not allowed to tape? So that didn't work. So her brother and sister tutored her in those courses. In the middle of all this, she was out for surgery for 6 months on her heel cords, adductors, hips, major surgery, and that interrupted the schooling. So generally, it was not a good experience, except for orientation mobility. She learned a lot about walking and navigating around the city and getting around, and that was very helpful. And even though the school said she was not a candidate for a high school diploma, she got a high school diploma using a computer, which was then allowed to take the exams. One of the people who saved us was Janny, and Janny was our babysitter, who also came almost every day after school to do physical therapy with Tammy and help her with homework until I got home from work. And without Janny, I don't think we would have made it through that time. And she ended up with a high school diploma. After high school, the next step was, what do we do now? We looked at some specialized colleges, but decided it really didn't make sense for Tammy. And the things we needed to focus on were her living situation, work, and computer training. And I had been on various state boards and things and knew that money was going to start coming for something called the Governor's Transitioning Initiative. And I wanted to get Tammy into that because otherwise she would go on a long waiting list for housing and supports. So we had to, in order to be eligible, she had to be out of the house. She couldn't be living at home. And Dave didn't want her to move out. Tammy didn't want to move out, and I was shoving her out. And we found a place for her to live with a roommate. And she got into the program, and as a result, got funding to support her with work and also someone to come and help her a bit at home. She lived with a roommate for a year, and then the roommate was an intern at Shock Trauma and then was moving to Florida, we knew. And then we weren't able to find another roommate. Tammy also has autism, and she's very difficult to live with, as her sister can attest to. She does better on her own than having a roommate 24/7. And so she moved out on her own into her own apartment with a lot of supports from us and from Jewish Family Services. At first, she volunteered at Peabody Institute, which is our music institute, answering telephones. And she could see the lights on the phone, so she could be trained to transfer calls. Then she got a job at the Museum of Industry in our harbor, and she could see the lights on those phones, and then her retina detached. And it could not be reattached. They tried. So she became totally blind, and she couldn't go back to that job because it depended on seeing the lights on the phone. At that point, we knew she needed a lot of computer training, and I'm going to be talking about that in when we get to my office. And she needed more touch typing, and she got all that, and then landed a job at the Arc of Baltimore as a receptionist. And her computer, by then she was trained on the computer, and she could hear the synthesizer on the computer, and she took several hundred calls a day. They came in and went into her computer, and then she transferred the calls. She started out with somebody else in the front office. They also welcomed people coming in. And eventually, as they had lost some funding, they moved the other person somewhere else, and there was Tammy as the receptionist. And she did a beautiful job. She worked there for 15 years. In Maryland, you're still allowed to work even if you're receiving other funds, such as SSDI, SSI. That's not true in Massachusetts. So she did that until she moved up here. When she lost her sight, she moved back home for a year. It was extremely upsetting to her and to us. And she had to go through a lot of adjustment before she moved back out. One of the people who was key was a friend of ours who's a musician who's blind and also a rehab worker, and he worked with her on cooking skills at home and all sorts of things, mobility, and just talking to her because he had lost his sight when he was 16, and he knew what she was going through. When about 10 years ago, Tammy's sister, Katie, said that when Tammy got older and Katie's kids got older and were no longer in elementary school, she offered to have Tammy move up here, and Katie would coordinate things for Tammy. Not that Tammy would live with her, but that she would sort of be like the case manager, which is a major, major job. And Katie's friends got older, and I got more feeble. I had knee replacements, I had hip replacements, I broke my wrist, and I could feel I just couldn't lift that wheelchair anymore. And have Tammy sort of pulling on my arm. And so we decided it was time to come to Boston, and she moved here 6 years ago. and it's been wonderful, except for COVID. Um, we had to start all over again. You know, in Maryland, we knew all the resources. I'd been on all sorts of committees like you join, you know, when you want to learn more about something. And here we were in Massachusetts not knowing a thing. We researched everything before she moved up, and still we didn't know a thing. We talked to JVS, Jewish Vocational Services, the JCC, UCP, the Carroll Center, the American Foundation for the Blind. We went to a special ed fair and talked to all the organizations there, and looked into different housing models. And the one we picked turned out to be not very successful. We picked a program where there would be supports from a nonprofit, but where Tammy would have a roommate, and the roommate would be paid to help her, but also be allowed to work. And it just didn't work well for a variety of reasons. And so we really needed to go back and think it through again. And the second time we did much better. We found a wonderful program in Newton called Scandinavian Living Center. And it's really an assisted living center for older people, but has all the programs that we wanted for Tammy. So she has her own apartment, which is great. She doesn't have a roommate, which is perfect for her. She gets meals. They have lots of programs there if she wants to participate. It's modeled after Scandinavia, where the community is very involved and welcomed. So they house the Newton at Home program. They have choruses. They teach Spanish. People from the outside come to hear concerts and lectures. But it's just one level of care. It's just assisted living. It's not like here. And Tammy moved in there, and it's been wonderful. We had to find all new doctors, which, as everybody knows, when you move from another state is not easy, and specialists. And we were fortunate over time to find wonderful eye doctors at Mass Eye and Ear through our old eye doctors at Hopkins, and also to find a wonderful physiatrist who only sees adults with cerebral palsy, which was perfect for us. And we found dermatologists, we found somebody for her shingles that she developed, and on and on and on. So over time that worked out well, but it was challenging. And then the next thing was we wanted her to learn to use an iPhone. And we signed her up for workshops and lessons and tried all sorts of things, sort of long distance while we're in Baltimore, and she had difficulty learning. And I went to one of the workshops, and I understood why she had difficulty learning. Nobody was learning, because you really need one-on-one instruction if you're totally blind. It's hard enough to learn the iPhone if you have eyesight. So I sent emails to everyone I knew in the blind community and just social community up here, telling the problem to see if we could find anyone. And one of the people she knew through a support group suggested a young lady who was an occupational therapist who worked at Perkins School for the Blind, and her specialty is assistive technology. And Tammy met with her, and they were off and running. It took about 3 or 4 months to teach Tammy to use the iPhone, because it's partly through Siri and speaking, and then it's partly through flicking your finger a certain way. And you can imagine if you closed your eyes and tried to use your iPhone, what you'd be up against. And she learned to use it. It's like her computer now, like for all of us. She watches Netflix, she texts, she calls people, she listens to movies, she reads books a lot. So it's been wonderful, and especially during COVID. And we have Andrea to thank for that. I'm going to show you a picture of Andrea in a minute. So Andrea started with her about the first year she was here, and has been with her ever since. This was a godsend during COVID because when Scandinavian Living Center closed down, just like Newbridge did, and guests couldn't come in, her sister couldn't come in, nobody could come in to help her, we couldn't come in. Andrea was considered a staff person because she was an OT and was able to come in twice a week to help Tammy. And this made a huge difference because Tammy would have been totally isolated in her room. I mean, she would have meals and, staff coming in and out briefly, but this went on for, I don't know how, do you remember, Katie, how long? It seems like a long time, whatever it was. You don't remember either. In April, and I was going to ask Katie to tell this part of the story. You up for it? You can just stand. No, I didn't warn her ahead. Just tell about when Tammy moved in and all that.
Yeah, so beginning of April, they had a number of cases.
Wait a minute, we'll get your microphone. Michael has one too.
I'm trying for Jeff. Can you guys hear me? Yeah. So in April, the Scandinavian Living Center had a number of COVID cases, and we made the decision to pull Tammy and have her come live with us in our house in Newton. And we had about an hour to turn our dining room into her bedroom. And she, we went and packed her up and got everything set, and she lived with us from April till August of that first year until things settled down a bit. And, it was challenging for everyone because she lost her independence, and we had, extra responsibilities and a house full of 5 people and 2 dogs feeling trapped like everyone else was during the beginning of lockdown. So, we made it through, but it was certainly a challenge.
So it sounded very difficult to me. Trying to coordinate schedules with 2 teenagers in the house, and Tammy, who has difficulty in new situations finding her way around. They put her in the dining room because it was a straight shot to the bathroom. So she could walk from the dining room to the bathroom. But other than that, she needed help getting around. So there was a lot of planning involved, and it was extremely difficult. And then she moved back into Scandinavian, and when the next couple cases, mild cases of COVID came, we decided to leave her at Scandinavian Living Center. Like here, she was vaccinated early and all that. So everybody there, it's just like here, where they've all been vaccinated and boosted, whatever. But it was a trying year. A year ago, was it last January, she choked on she got cellulitis for the 3rd time in her feet from her braces rubbing on her foot, and was taking antibiotics, also got C. diff for about 6 weeks, and choked on a large pill, and fell off the bed and hit her jaw, and ended up in the ER at Newton Wellesley. And fortunately, Katie got there in time and talked her way in because they were not letting anybody in the hospitals then. And she stayed with her the week or 5 days, whatever it was, she was there. And Tammy was in pretty bad shape. At the beginning, she seemed very disoriented, hardly knew who we were on the phone and whatever, but eventually she came round and came home. But it was very stressful. We didn't go up because we weren't vaccinated. There were no vaccinations yet, and we couldn't get in the hospital. So there wasn't much point in going up because we couldn't even see her. And I think that's when we started thinking about moving up here. We'd already thought about it, but that sort of sealed the deal. And we contacted Newbridge and got on the waiting list. So that was her time then. Wanted to just show some happy slides. This is And I can see time is running. No, it's upside down, sorry. This is Tammy at the beach on Martha's Vineyard. For years, she couldn't go to the beach because we couldn't get her over the sand dunes. And I found a organization, Operation Smile in Massachusetts, that puts beach wheelchairs on beaches. And they were starting to put them on a lot of beaches in the state. And I said, please put one in Aquina. And they did. And there she is. She goes right over the dunes and down to the water like everybody else. This is a picture of Andrea, her OT and helper, who comes to Martha's Vineyard with her every summer and is so helpful. It's a picture of a friend who takes her out on his motorboat, and she's learning to steer. And then this is a picture from last week. We went to the Gardner Museum, and we arranged a private touch tour where Tammy can wear a glove and touch a lot of the statues. And this lady was so well prepared. We had done this 3 years ago, and they were fine, but this was so much better. She even had a bag of the different fabrics on the wall and the ceiling and the pictures, things Tammy couldn't touch, but she had a sample of it. It was great. And she had so much to tell us. We're going back for part 2 in May. This is at our 50th anniversary with 3 dogs and teenage kids. And then finally, this is Maggie, Tammy's dog. When Tammy moved here, Katie got her a dog. The dog lives with Katie but belongs to Tammy on the left. And you might recognize who's on the right, Blake. Blake came to visit a couple weeks ago. Blake the Springer Spaniel, who lives here. And he came for a visit, and Tammy petted him, and he was so soft and friendly. I want to go quickly on to the next section because I'm running out of time. I wanted to talk next about, we saw from Tammy how important computer technology was to her and her life, and she had received some training, and we wanted her to get more training. We also wanted to share this with other people. So Dave and I decided to start a technology center, a nonprofit technology center for people with disabilities. It was modeled after 47 programs around the country at that time. We were all under an umbrella organization, but we each were our own nonprofits and had our own boards and had to raise our own money. And we called it LINK, Learning Independence Through Computers. It was in downtown Baltimore. And it was a resource center with state-of-the-art microcomputer technology. It was a place where children and adults with all types of disabilities fulfill their potential to become independent at home and successful at school and at work. This is from our first annual report in 1990. These were a few of the things we started out with. We provided consultations, computer clubs for kids, open houses, workshops, evaluation and training, and outreach programs, and then expanded on those as we grew. We believe that every person with a disability should have access to the benefits of technology, no matter what the disability or age or national origin. And this started LINK. We had no money, so we started by getting our nonprofit status. We asked a friend who was a lawyer to do this, and he was our pro bono lawyer for the first 25 years. And once we got our 501c3, our nonprofit status, we started fundraising. We sent letters to everybody we knew, no pressure, no phone calls, seeing if they wanted to help us get started financially. And then we started applying to foundations. And our belief was that we have funding from different sources, so if any one source dried up, we still had money. So we had foundation support, individual support, we had fundraisers, we had fee-for-service, and we had government money. And that was our goal. It didn't all happen at once, believe me. I'm going to start with some of the very simple things we did, and this is from 1991, some of these pictures, 92, 93, so obviously the technology has changed. This is Michael. He's using a single switch, it's called a jelly bean switch, and you push the switch and then something happens with the toy. You could also use this with a computer, but it's a cause and effect for young kids or people with severe disabilities. Benji has probably the cognitive ability of about a 1-year-old. He uses a single switch and he couldn't move his hands, but he could move his jaw. And then something happened on the computer screen. And this was one of the first toys his father said he could play with. This is a picture of, let me see where I am. Okay. This is at a computer club, and this is Wapei, who's from China. We had a number of students from China who were studying at Hopkins who helped us on the weekends. And this little boy has Down syndrome, and he's learning to use a computer. This is a unicorn keyboard, and this little girl was in our schools program. We had computers in 5 city schools as well as in the kids' homes for kids with disabilities who were mainstreamed into regular classrooms. And that's called a unicorn keyboard. It's just a simplified keyboard that's not so overwhelming to operate the computer. These boys are in our computer camp. We ran a camp each summer for kids with and without disabilities and had a different theme each summer, and also visited attractions in the harbor. Then going to some of the adults, this is Annette. She's totally blind, and she's learning screen reading, which the computer reads the screen to you. What's on the screen, either by the letter, the word, the paragraph. It can hear you typing. And she was applying for a government job and wanted to get her skills up in typing and also using the computer, which is pretty complicated. And she got the job. This is Maxwell. He was on our board. He was a law professor at Maryland. He had come from Nigeria. And he was very computer literate, but he wanted to learn to use, what was it called, Dave? Portable what? I can't remember. Note taker, thank you. This is, you can see on top of the computer is a little device that just has 6 keys, just like a Perkins Brailler. And he was doing note taking, which would be printed out in Braille. And he was amazing. He knew every piece of equipment. We also got funding from the federal government to do job training for people in empowerment zones. Those are low income zones, and I think 7 cities in the country were empowerment cities at that time, and we got one of the grants. It was for training people with severe disabilities in technology and placing them in jobs and providing supports. And this is Michael. He has severe autism, and he was placed at the State Department of Education. This lady was head of special ed at the time, and had technology training and has worked there for many years now. We found that some of our hardest placements were people with autism because of the social skills. We took one young man who had wonderful computer skills to a job interview, and he walked around behind the interviewer and asked him what he was writing. And I thought, oh, you know, the interviewer wasn't very sympathetic. This is a puff and sip. This man, Miguel, is unable to use his hands. He has a device that he puffs and sips into, and that acts like a mouse or trackball inputting. So that just gives you a sense of the range of kinds of technology we had at the time, and now it's all changed. I probably wouldn't recognize it anymore because I retired more than 10 years ago. In our 10th year, we had the most exciting fundraiser. Wynton Marsalis donated a concert for us at our Meyerhoff, which is our symphony hall. There are 6 boys in the family, 4 musicians. One brother, Mboya, has severe autism, and another brother is a techie. He's a computer guy, and he lived in Baltimore, and that was our link to Wynton. So Wynton did the concert absolutely for free. He got together a couple of his friends. The day before, his father, Ellis, who is a well-known pianist, who unfortunately passed away from COVID a couple years ago, came up and did workshops in the inner city with kids, and they all brought their instruments and played with him. And then at the concert, Wynton, the first half, played with one of our inner city jazz bands. This is a picture of Tammy and me speaking at the intermission. Tammy was the speaker, and she talked about technology. There were more than 2,000 people there. But she's very poised about that sort of thing. So that's the end. I was hoping we'd have time for people to talk about their experiences with caregiving and any questions. Anyone who has to leave, feel free. Thank you. Yes.
I used to work with the blind in Cleveland and here at the Carroll Center. And,
Oh, okay.
and in Cleveland, we had students over the summer in the summer program, and we would take them to the baseball game. And all the kids would have their transistor radios.
Exactly.
And we would hear what they were saying, but then we could watch and we could translate, the stuff to them. It was a lot of fun.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That's a great way for someone who's blind to hear what's going on at the baseball game. And we have a friend who lost his sight, and I kept saying, why don't you go to the baseball game with us? He just didn't get it. I said, well, Tammy takes the radio. He said, I can't see it. So you have to be creative. Any other? Yeah. Oh, over here?
So from your point of view, Tammy was fully included. I'm wondering if you asked her what her experience was and what her perception was of her early life. Second question, a lot of disabled people that I know who have been mainstreamed have experienced bullying, and I'm wondering how you dealt with that.
I don't know what she would say about her early experiences. You have any thoughts, Dave? I've never asked her.
Certainly her trips, like going to the vineyard, going to Yachad's various junkets were really very, very enjoyable for her. She really liked very much interacting with non-disabled kids who were persons who were of her age, and that was really a critical element in trying to find rewarding activities for her.
Katie? Yeah, here's the sister's perspective.
I think one thing I would say is I think having siblings was helpful because she was with us with whatever we were doing. And I think having her be in the elementary school right from the start, many kids didn't look at it as anything unusual. They just sort of went with it. I see the same thing with my kids because they've been around her so much. There's much less of the, this is something so different than my own experience that I don't want to get anywhere near it. And I think just because right from the start she was, at all the play dates and, in the classroom and everything else, that certainly made a big difference. was it 100% inclusion? Probably not, but it was far more than most other kids at that time, I would say.
She didn't experience too much, we didn't call it bullying in those days, but some teasing, kids doing something behind her back as they got older towards middle school. Half the time I don't think she knew what was happening unless she heard them giggling because she couldn't see what they were doing easily. But it wasn't a big deal. Most of the kids had grown up with her, they knew her, you know, some interacted with her, some didn't. Some were very kind to her, and they just sort of took her for granted. You know, that she was in the class or one of the group or whatever, and that the fact that she acted strangely or differently was just sort of accepted.
Mira, I noticed that you didn't talk a lot about the very early years. Were early intervention services available to you, for the ones that are for 0 to 3-year-olds? They were just emerging after Public Law 142. Mm-hmm. So I'm just wondering if you had any experience with that and how that was helpful.
Well, she was a toddler and a preschooler before infants and toddlers program started. So there were really no supports that we knew of. And she was fortunate. She was at a daycare center that was fabulous and provided its own supports. So we really didn't need any in preschool. It was more the elementary school is where things started to fall apart a bit due to lack of services. And we were in a poor inner city. We were not in the inner city, but we were in a poor city school system.
So
Anybody else?
Well, I'd like to, first of all, thank you for sharing this. I was very moved by what you've said, and also wanted to just say how it was wonderful how you took all these challenges, and they obviously were major challenges, and made positive things out of them. And in this day and age, unfortunately, that seems to occur less and less frequently. And anyway, I want to just acknowledge that and say how important that is. And as somebody who has a trivial disability, I could tell you that the Americans for Disabilities Act was an amazing piece of legislation. Mm-hmm. And it was actually the senator from Connecticut who really pushed that. Mm-hmm. And all I can say is that the curb cuts, I know all about curb cuts and lack of them. And
you could write a book about them,
right,
I'm sure.
Right. But in the U.S., we're very blessed with the number of curb cuts that we have compared to other countries in the world. Anyway, thank you so much, and thank you for sharing this.